As the long overdue pushback against the attacks on our freedom of movement continues apace, admirable pressure groups like the Together Association and others rightly highlight issues like the massively increased financial burden that will be imposed. Hard-working people will be faced with the unenviable choice of either getting themselves into immediate debt by being forced to buy a newer ULEZ compliant car, or by accruing that debt slowly but nevertheless surely by swallowing an extra £250 of travelling costs a month on top of their usual budget, a budget that is already probably straining at the seams because of the cost of fuel for their home rather than their vehicle, not to mention hiked up mortgage repayments and grocery price inflation. In addition, there are also cases of the vulnerable, the infirm, the disabled, and the underpaid carers who rely on their old, cheap vehicles in order to look after them. It's unfair to force these spiralling costs on anybody, but it's especially unfair to them, and it's only right and proper that their cases are highlighted above all others. It's a cliche, but as usual, one with a nugget of truth at the centre of it, that one should judge society by the way it treats its most vulnerable. But as admirable as it is to fight the battles of the poor, the old and the dispossessed, there is something that is lost in that approach, and it's something that's rather important. As regular viewers will be well aware, my particular hobby horse is unwarranted blanket government surveillance. Over the years, I've met many people who've professed to be fellow travellers, but knowing the relative ineffectiveness of surveillance cameras in detecting and preventing crime, they would often use what I call the Al Capone approach as an objection. As most of you will know, Al Capone was a violent, sadistic and murderous Chicago gangster who rose to prominence during the Prohibition era. Despite being targeted and pursued by law enforcement numerous times for murder, racketeering and other serious crimes, nothing would stick. In the end, the authorities managed to convict him on the much lesser charge of tax evasion, and he was in prison for 11 years and was never again a threat to anybody. Now, this may have been celebrated as pretty clever at the time and since in films like the 1987 offering The Untouchables, but perhaps all it achieved was to remove one violent psychopath from society in the moment. But in doing so, perhaps all it really succeeded in doing was sending the message that any subsequent gangsters had only to keep the tax affairs of their criminal enterprises up to date in order to avoid censure from the authorities. So it may seem clever to object to CCTV cameras on the grounds of their cost, and more particularly value for money, when the public purse is involved, is an issue. It's what many of the aforementioned hard-working types have to pay into, whether they can afford it or not. As such, it is not a trivial matter. But neither is it the heart of the matter. It's peripheral, and if the peripheral matter can be solved, it can be solved without fixing the central problem. Thus, if the cost of surveillance can be reduced and by some arbitrary measure solved, does that then mean that the central issue of unwarranted invasive government surveillance is also solved? Of course not. All that has been achieved is that something bad, in this case invasive surveillance, has now been made, in this case, even more achievable. That's the trap, and it's one they want you to fall into. But we should argue against these things on a point of principle. Principles shouldn't change, no matter what else does. That's their strength. They can't really be weakened. They can be ignored, as they were so obviously ignored during COVID, but that is a measure of their strength. The fact that almost nobody on the other side of the aisle, during COVID or since, wants to discuss the blatant violation of the Nuremberg Code, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, nor the relevant sections of the European Court of Human Rights, is proof of it. They won't argue against the principle of bodily autonomy and informed consent, because they can't, so they ignore it. But ignored or not, there it stands, shining brightly, untarnished and undiminished, ready to be wielded anew by those who value it over the cheap utility of pragmatism. And so we should argue against 15-minute cities, low traffic neighbourhoods, and the proposed banning of the manufacture and sale of private vehicles with a viable and affordable power plant, and that means petrol and diesel, on the very same ground. Principle. And that principle is freedom of movement. In a good faith society such as we until very recently had, our freedom of movement was a given. Ever since 1985, when I got my driving licence, I was able to, and frequently did, travel at any hour of the day or night, to wherever I wanted, without the permission of anybody. And although I did get pulled by the police on a few occasions in the early hours of the morning, it was never even implied by any of the officers concerned that I had no right to be there, and at that hour. I was coerced once or twice into taking a breathalyser, but that's just the filth being the filth and fishing for an arrest. And as a lone young man, I was questioned about my activities, but again that was just plod being plod, which even I have to concede is them at least trying to do their job. Although they had no evidence, but merely suspicion, they were acting upon that suspicion in order to make me reveal that I had been engaged in something that was criminal. But whatever criminal offence that may have been suspected, driving around alone at 4 a.m. wasn't one of them. I was allowed to do that, no matter how suspicious it might seem. And we still have that freedom of movement, even as they do everything in their power, and frequently things way beyond their powers, to try to deny us that freedom. They dare not confront it head on. The first assault on this freedom has been going on for over 2 decades, automatic number plate recognition, or ANPR, which first started being installed, without recourse to an Act of Parliament, I hasten to add, which to my mind makes it illegitimate and illegal, all the way back in 2002. Many, many more have been added in the last 3 years. 3 years in which something significant, I can't imagine what, might well have happened. Something that might have taken our attention. Many of my townsfolk will not have noticed that they cannot now go into our local town without the authorities knowing about it. But I have. And now that the probably similar ULEZ cameras in London and others up and down the country are going up, and people are beginning to realise the real, specific financial impact that they will have on their pockets, they might, finally, begin to wonder whether the ability of the state knowing exactly where they are at every possible moment was something that they might have paid more attention to at the time. For I live in hope that it may finally force people into thinking of principle in place of expedience. I live in hope that it may force people to understand that when things get done to others, and they don't do anything to defend those others, it will in the end be done to them. I live in hope that people will begin to realise that acting in a principled matter is not only a selfless act, that it is often a selfish act that nevertheless can benefit others as well. I live in hope that people will begin to realise that the famous poem about the persecution of the Jews in Nazi Germany, first they came for the socialists, isn't just a fatuous trope to be trotted out to showcase one's compassion in the easiest, laziest and cheapest way possible, but is in fact a genuine reaction to a real and recently remembered horror that was inflicted on one set of people by another. I live in hope that people will actually look a bit further than 6 inches in front of their face and realise that it is not actually possible to remove the freedoms of others without removing them from themselves. People who live in the countryside, county towns and the outer suburbs may well feel that 15-minute cities and low traffic neighbourhoods are nothing to do with them, and they can remain outside the argument, supposedly safe in the belief that the issue will not affect them. And they'd be right. For a while. They might reason that it is really not worth any effort, nor to expend any resources on something that is not their business. And if they were particularly selfish, they might even think that resisting on or protesting on behalf of others might well cause the authorities to shine a light in their direction. But it will come to their door soon enough. As we learnt to our cost during COVID, acquiescing to authoritarian measures doesn't make them back off. If a normal person, like a boss for instance, asks an employee to do something that they wouldn't normally do, like work extra hours or take on the work of 2 or more extra people, and they did it, the employee would likely be rewarded with a bit extra in their paycheck or an unscheduled day off, since the boss, at least in some sense, requires the goodwill of the employee, or else they'll be going elsewhere. But controlling and authoritarian governments aren't like that. They're not like normal people. They don't feel that they need us. Their response is far more likely to be, well, we got them to do that when they said they weren't going to. Let's see what else we can make them do. As the slogan goes, your compliance will be rewarded with further restrictions. The midget megalomaniac that is Sadiq Khan, after having expanded London's congestion zone into what is now known as ULEZ, or the ultra-low emission zone, into the middling boroughs of the capital, he is now charging full speed ahead with pushing it all the way out to the M25. And as usual with authoritarian control freaks, he is planning to enforce it with the video surveillance of ANPR cameras. But it turns out that not only have his air quality figures, by which he justifies it, been called into question, but that he has already ordered those cameras even before the consultation has been completed. Talk about a fait accompli. The globalists, of which he is a prominent and preening figure, are not planning to stop any time soon. And once the ULEZ expansion has been achieved, Khan plans to use the camera infrastructure to introduce road charging. This may be due to more of the same in achieving a surveillance panopticon of London, which has always been one of the most ardent desires of the parasite class in keeping a close eye on the livestock. Or it may well be that Khan needs to fill a hole in Transport for London's debt that was already running at over £12 billion even before COVID. If anything can fill a £12 billion hole, it's forcing Londoners and others to pay for the privilege of using its roads, and to hell with any notions of a free society. Unlike most others, from my point of view, the most egregious part of this is the surveillance. The fact that Khan has managed to get TfL £12 billion into the red when it has an almost total monopoly of public transport in a city of 8 million people is just an example of his governing uselessness as mayor. But it's the surveillance that gets my goat. If it were just about making the polluter pay, why not just put it on the fuel? Scrap the congestion charge, scrap ULEZ and scrap car tax and put it on the price of a gallon. I appreciate that in the current climate, increasing the cost of anything is a hard sell. But if we did that, there would be no need for all this surveillance. There would be no need for the cameras and the rest of the infrastructure. And there would be no need for 3,000 work-shy long COVID skivers at DVLA. There is no need, from a financial point of view, to charge people for access to the capital's roads when the charge can be put on the price of fuel. In that way, it's the user that pays. So the owner of the 5-litre V8 Range Rover will pay very much more than a 1-litre Micra. What could be fairer than that? The surveillance apparatus seems to be an unnecessary, and not to say expensive, overcomplication. So once again, as with so many things regarding surveillance, it seems that there may be some other reason as to why they might be wanting to keep track of us, and I dare not speculate as to what that reason is. But the main takeaway from this is that they will only stop when we make them stop. Every inch we concede will encourage them to take another, and another, and another. They don't see us making concessions as being reasonable. They don't see concessions as a good faith attempt at achieving a compromise, much like those voracious Islamists with which they share rather a surprising amount in common. They see each concession as nothing more than weakness. What's that phrase? Don't mistake my kindness for weakness. So have they? Have they mistaken it? Or are they correct? Have they correctly appraised our kindness, or rather our reasonableness, as being virtually indistinguishable from weakness? If they have, it's hardly surprising. We as a society had many, many cherished ideals that, before March of 2020, almost nobody would have even considered transgressing, and pretty much all of them: bodily autonomy, informed consent, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, democratic accountability, the rule of law, due process, the scientific method, to name but a few, were bulldozed in the hysterical COVID spasm in the months and years that followed. And what message did that send to them? Did it communicate to them that we would defend our principles no matter what? Or did it instead suggest to them that we could be manipulated, and easily so, into abandoning everything we said that we held dear by the application of a little, and it really was only a little, fear? When was it exactly that we began to scare so easily? It could have been March 2020, but my guess is that much else, the decay began much earlier, like the rotting of underfloor joists that are only revealed once a renovation takes place, the water-sodden ceiling beneath the bath, the unseen rust that condemns a shiny and seemingly robust car to the scrapyard. These things happen when we don't notice, are distracted by other things, or when we fail to do the maintenance. I suppose in a sense it's not our fault. We've had over 75 years of peace and relative prosperity that has softened us up. The generation that fought the Second World War had only 21 years since the previous war, and they had had the Great Depression in between. But I'll wager that there were people in the late 30s that were bemoaning the fact that the younger generation in particular had not had the same hardships as those that had been through the last war, the Great War. But that generation had to toughen up and do it quickly, and they did, and then some. A prominent historian remarked that once they got into their stride, the British fought back with a determination that amounted almost to savagery. But we are no longer savages, more's the pity, although we may perhaps be importing some. But it is us that need to be. We absolutely need to be. We must find the inner savage in all of us. It's there, if we dig deep enough. The savage that declares, by deed, even more than by word, no, you will not do this. You will not cross this line. Or perhaps more correctly, we should say, we will draw our own lines and ignore the ones you draw for us. We shall be the ones who draw the lines, not you, and woe betide you if you cross them. So the lines are the ones that are outside of your house or your flat, mostly at the moment in the cities, but increasingly so in the suburbs, and they will reach the market towns and even the villages soon enough. The lines may not look like lines, but will instead look like surveillance cameras, bollards and giant wooden planters with road close signs on them. Those are their lines, not ours, so they should be ignored and their supporting infrastructure removed. They have no legitimacy. They have no right to block the public highway. And they are public highways, paid for by you, the taxpayer. And don't let them take charge of the language either. They are not cut-throughs or rat runs. They are public roads, and they belong to us. So the principle of freedom of movement is not about being free to clog up our towns and cities without consequences, because those consequences are obvious and immediate in the form of frustrating and time-wasting traffic jams. These are the consequences that we accept because we have caused them, and when we are unwilling to pay for those consequences any longer, we make alternative arrangements. We take the train, and in the case of London, we take the train simply because it is pure folly to take your car into central London. And that's not new. That has been the case for 40 or 50 years. The congestion charging and now ULEZ are just making it nigh on impossible for the very few who would still, perhaps as a matter of need, attempt the journey. For almost half a century, it has been a matter of pragmatism not to drive into London. But freedom of movement is not about pragmatism. It's about principle. It's a freedom that we have, that is ours by right and not by permission. It may not be written down in a document, such as it is in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for example, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Indeed, the very fact that the right is enshrined in the document might actually make that right more fragile than if it isn't, since a right bequeathed by men can be removed by men. A natural right, such as freedom of movement is, can never rightfully be denied. That fact, that reality, has been highlighted by the fact that the countries that have written constitutions fared no better in securing their rights than countries that do not. Our de facto freedoms of movement, like the roads and the motor vehicles that facilitate those very freedoms, belong to us. Freedom of movement, given to us by natural law, or even by God if you prefer, is ours. By this stage of the game, it should be obvious what kind of a world they have in store for us if we fail to stand and fight for what is ours.